Welcome, everyone, to the S for Geo podcast. I'm Michael Hochberg. This series is designed as a dialogue between experts in geopolitical risk and opportunity and a variety of industry and technology specialists, corporate officers, and government officials, scientists, academics, and other practitioners. The goal is to provide insights into the myriad ways in which geopolitical dynamics are impacted or impact the global business environment. Today, our guest is my friend, Patrick Ennis. Patrick is a venture partner at Madrona Ventures Group. He's done more than 30 years as a scientist, engineer, businessman, and VC. He was at Intellectual Ventures for a decade, most recently running startup incubation and technology commercialization around the world. He's done a number of wildly successful investments. He's been an entrepreneur. He's been an operating executive. He's been originally a Bell Labs person, which for those of you who are connoisseurs of what that means that he's a stone technical badass. He's been in the nuclear industry. He's done a ton of business in Asia. He's been in and out of China more times than I can count, although he's better at math than I am, so he can probably count higher than I can. And he's one of my favorite people and one of my favorite VCs. So it's really a pleasure to have him on the podcast. Welcome, Patrick.
Thank you, Michael. Really appreciate it. You're too kind with the bio, and a little bit of it is true. When you add it all up, it basically means I'm old when you have all that much stuff on your resume. I was born when John Kennedy was president, and a lot of people look at me and say, "Who's John Kennedy?" So yeah, it was a long time ago.
That sounds about right. I'll remind our viewers that June 17th at noon Eastern time is our next talk, which will be on geopolitics for business, an ongoing experiment in providing a compass. That will be with Andrea Colli of Bocconi University. Today, our topic is the venture capital industry as an international activity. So, Patrick, let me kick this off with a starter question. VC is very much a industry that is headquartered on the West Coast in the United States, and it's spread around the world. But even as a US based VC, you actually have a lot of international activities. Can you talk a little bit about the different ways in which VC is intrinsically an international business?
Yeah, and it's certainly changed a lot in the years that I've been in the industry. I left Bell Labs in New Jersey in 1998 to move out to Seattle, which is where I'm based now. So, that's coming up on 28 years. And even then, it was international. And one of the reasons I moved to Seattle, there were many, but one of the reasons was, other than Alaska, it's the closest city to Asia, right? A lot of people don't realize that it's a sphere, the Earth's a sphere. So, California is not closer to Asia. Seattle is. All the flights from the Bay Area have to come up along the coast. And back then you always read about the quote unquote Asian century that was coming. So I wanted to be involved in that. But at that time, the vast majority of the venture capital activity was in the US. And the international aspect was more when a startup in California would grow enough, they would open up a sales office somewhere. There'd be a bag carrying salesperson that you would put in Tokyo or Beijing or London. And that's on the sales side. On the input side, you might have a development center in Bangalore. That's changed over the decades, where now a lot of these companies are either headquartered outside the US or they have substantial operations there with real decision-making executives. And I'm going off topic, so just feel free to interrupt me, but another important point is the rise of venture capital and startups in China. Now, China has gone through major changes with the current President Xi. It's a very different place with Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, where both of them realized the entrepreneurship and technical growth and innovation was not going to come from the top-down plans, state-owned enterprises, but rather from letting a technology venture capital industry flourish. And that's what happened. You had lots of startups in China and local Chinese VCs funding them and American VCs funding those Chinese startups. Now that changed dramatically with Xi, but there still is a very active China venture capital and startup industry, but it's kind of separated from us here in the US now, which brings additional challenges. So I'll take a breath there and feel free to redirect me.
How do you think about, like, when you look at the sort of aesthetic and practical choices that VCs make in what they invest in? Do you see a major cultural difference between US, China, Singapore, Europe? Like, are they investing in fundamentally the same kinds of things?
At a high level, you would say yes, but if you go a layer down, there is a fundamental difference. The US still is more comfortable with risk and failure, both collectively and individually. Here in the US, it's almost a badge of honor to say I did four startups and they all failed. Please give me money. I want to do a fifth one. And we like that because we think as investors, we think you actually learn a lot by failing. Um, and but in other countries, it can be shameful, and you don't get a second chance. I spent a lot of time in Korea. My wife is Korean, although she's now a U.S. citizen recently. But we have a house in Korea, and so to the extent that Irish American Catholic Jewish guy like myself can understand the Korean culture, there's a lot of shame if you fail. And you're not just shaming yourself, you're shaming your parents and the 20 generations before you, which are all recorded in the government records. Like literally I can go figure out who my kids, great, 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 great grandparents are. So it's important to understand both the Confucian and Buddhist traditions and reasons why shame is a big thing and therefore failure is difficult. Um, that's changed a lot in the last 20 years because I think of a lot of the entrepreneurial role models. Even in Korea, you have Kakao Talk and Naver and, even the K-pop and the K-dramas. That's all encourage people to think out of the box. But by and large, you don't get the risk taking. And the second thing that's different is the time frame. A lot of international venture capitalists seem to want to get that money in quicker. Make an investment and then get a return in 2 to 3 years. But early stage technology venture capital, like Michael, from all sides of the equation, some of the best successes and the best wins take 5, 10, even 15 years. And I think the Silicon Valley, and I mean Silicon Valley as a metaphor for all American VC, we're very comfortable waiting 10 or 15 years for that financial return. And that's not necessarily true outside the US. And I apologize for generalizing, right? Because you could come up with a zillion counterexamples in Singapore or London or elsewhere that disagree with what I just said.
One of the things I've noticed as a pattern is that the the international VCs that I've interacted with, which are more Europe than Asia, they they like the quick wins in the sense of they'll take a 10x, whereas a US VC would look at the 10x and say, no, 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 I want the next 10, right? Like they see an opportunity for a 10x exit after 3 years, and whereas most US VCs would say, let's keep doubling down, and would strongly push the entrepreneurs to keep doubling down, and would even engage secondaries to try to incentivize them to double down. And for those listening who don't know what I mean, secondaries are a tool for founders to get liquid before the VCs get liquid. So that allows them to sell some of their shares. The European VCs that I've interacted with, they're slower to deploy money, right? They don't write a check as fast, but they're faster to want an exit. Do you see that same kind of dynamic in Europe and in Asia?
Yeah, I think, yeah, so now we can get into a whole different topic as to the climate in Europe versus the climate in Asia for venture capital investing and startup creation. And it really mirrors a broader societal and economic and political discussion. It's amazing how it all flows from one to the other. Um, by and large, this isn't true in general. Europe's a big place. There is no Europe, right? It's a whole bunch of countries, just like there is no Asia. That's a recent, creation terminology wise. Every country and every region of every country is different. But in general, in Europe, there's quite a lot of pessimism. A lot of the best and the brightest, frankly, either go to Singapore to do startups or they want to come to America. Now, there are pockets of optimism and there are pockets of innovation, but by and large, the next generation feels pretty negative. And I think that mirrors they've got an economic problem, right? They've got an energy problem. It's hard to have a vibrant economy if you're not producing enough energy. And they have a social cohesion problem, which, Lord, we could spend hours talking about that, and I'll just leave it at that. There just seems to be a lot more optimism, and that is reflective of the financial terms that these startups get from venture capitalists. As you point out, the European venture capitalists have different constraints than some of the other money sources around the world.
Have you seen, I mean, obviously there's huge venture activity in Israel. They're doing extremely well. Where do you see the places that are really doing non-linearly effective things in venture outside the US and Israel?
Yeah, I mean, I almost want to say, well, let's just talk about the U.S. and Israel, and
Ha!
and and because Israel is absolutely astounding. I don't think people quite it's a geek word, grok. I don't think they quite understand what Israel has done with a very small population for many years, and I think it's still true. If you look at the NASDAQ or any public market in the US, outside the US, which country has the most number of tech IPOs or tech public companies? It's not France, it's not Germany, it's not China, it's Israel. And it's quite astounding. So there's so much cross-border stuff going on with US startups that have development center in Israel or co-investing with Israel venture capitalists. And even during the worst of the current events, people have been flying back and forth. And, just a couple of weeks ago, one of the funds I work with just had a week in Tel Aviv. Yeah, so because of that, other countries collaborate with the US and Israel. So Singapore, Finland, other smaller countries that feel like they identify with the challenges and opportunities of having 5 to 15 million people in a country. How do you build an entrepreneurial ecosystem? So that's why I bring up those two in particular, Finland and Singapore, with a big emphasis on Singapore. Singapore's come a long way. They're also risk averse, they're very bureaucratic, which we'll blame on the legacy of the British Empire. Though I'm not sure it's entirely their fault. But Singapore has grand ambitions, and because of it's getting harder to get visas to come to the U.S. to study or to become a professor. So the universities and the other entities in Singapore have the ability to attract some world-class talent that normally would go to the US, but now they can cherry pick because Singapore makes it easy to come if you're a PhD or an entrepreneur or a venture capitalist. They'll give you a visa in a day and welcome you for a period of time.
So how do you think about when like as a VC, you have a few functions, right? One of them is looking for new deals. Another is bringing in money from LPs. Another is actually deploying capital. Another is helping your existing companies, and then you know, uh, and then there's of course the exit stage, right? Every one of those you have the option of doing things within the US or overseas, right? You can bring in outside money, you can fund companies that are, you could choose to fund companies in China or in Singapore or in Estonia or in Israel, whatever you want, right? The wonderful thing about being a VC is that there's an infinite number of potentially interesting things to invest in. And if you're good, there's an infinite universe of places that you could bring capital in from. How do you think about the choice between bringing in domestic money and overseas money? How do you think about the trade-off between deploying money domestically versus overseas?
Yeah, I think it's always easier to do stuff locally. That doesn't mean it's best or optimum. It's just easier. Um, One thing we try to fight is the search for comfort, right? You know that old saying, the desire for comfort is your greatest enemy.
Mm.
Um, and that's true in your personal and professional life. And it's important to think about that. And it comes from you're hiking in the mount. I live in the mountains east of Seattle, and we've got lots of snow in the winter. You're hiking in the mountains in the winter, and you're cold. You're stuck in a blizzard. You're all upset, and you tell yourself, "Let me just sit down for a little bit. I'll feel so
Mm.
comfortable just sitting down, you know." And that, you got to keep going through it, right? And from a work perspective, you always have to avoid just sort of doing the easy thing. Yeah, it would be easiest if all the companies I invested in were right here, so I could just walk across town and have breakfast with the inventor and an entrepreneur. But if you do that, you're ruling out the other 7.8 billion people on the planet. So we really do try to have a global viewpoint, but more importantly, the notion of syndicate partners comes into play, especially when you're investing in deep technology. As you know, you often need well more than one investor. So if we're going to invest in a geography that's far away, we at least want a trusted partner on the ground who can do those breakfasts on short notice. The other thing from a technology perspective, so many startups are not built on one idea. They're built on a whole bunch of ideas that are integrated because a lot of the low-hanging fruit has already been picked. So therefore, when you meet a professor from Caltech and you know a thing or two about Caltech, he or she may feel that they've got that breakthrough to cure cancer. But it may turn out if you put together that technology with something from, PKU in Beijing or Oxford and roll it up, you'll have a much stronger product, a much stronger company, and a much easier time raising money. But that's not comfortable, right? That's hard to do that because you got to negotiate with three different universities and get everyone to put their ego aside. But some of the best startups are built that way.
How do you think about taking money from overseas LPs these days?
Yeah, I mean, there's a quick answer to that. There's just certain countries that are radioactive and you can't take money from. That's just practically speaking. Obvious ones, obviously, you can't take money from North Korea or Iran, places that you think there might be money laundering. But sadly, and I say this sadly because I do wish we could all get along. Earlier in my career, the US and China were getting along great from a venture capital perspective, and money was flowing in both directions. US VCs would happily take Chinese investors into their funds and vice versa. That's completely not the case now. So, pretty much every American institutional investor really can't or won't take money from China because it brings with it so many reporting requirements and so many restrictions on what you do with your investment. But other than that, um, money from allies, and I put that in quotes because that's a complicated term to define, but US VCs pretty much happily take money from a Samsung or a Sony, or a Singapore entity, and obviously most of the European countries also. But in general, the US money is easier because it's just less paperwork. But again, that's the comfort thing. We'll take international money if there's a strategic reason. For instance, if you have Samsung as an investor, that might be useful because they're one of the world's largest value-added, corporations. So maybe you want to, do some work with them, but there has to be a reason to take the money. Unless it's your first fund and you don't have a choice, then you raise whatever money you can within the confines of what's customary, allowed, and legal.
So this China issue is a really interesting one. Let's take that as an example for a second. Is it that the VCs are legally prohibited from taking money from China, or is it a matter of them making a moral choice, or is it that they perceive risk, but it's future regulatory risk? Like, what's stopping?
Yeah, I will say, I mean, I can't speak for everyone, but it isn't really moral per se, because I don't think that's the way most investors think about it, because it's such a complicated issue, and it depends on where you've been and who you've talked to and where you're from, right? I mean, I give another talk on demographics of entrepreneurs in the U.S., and there's, millions of wonderful, productive neighbors here in the US that are either Chinese or Chinese Americans or Americans of Chinese descent. And I think I covered it properly by phrasing it that way. And, my wife is now a Korean American. My kids are Americans of Korean descent. I say that because I don't want to offend people. I want to be inclusive. So it isn't like China bad, USA good, right? It's more a matter of current Chinese government and current Chinese military, you might say they're bad, and I don't mean that in a judgmental way, but it's not the 1.4 billion, great people. So that's why the moral thing is very, very tricky. I think it's more a matter of there is not an out and out prohibition of taking the money. And as you know, the US and China are not decoupled. There's been a lot of talk of decoupling. It's just not. In fact, it's probably impossible. But just look around the room, how much of this, you know, was either made in China or, has Chinese parts or vice versa. And the US has huge operations in China, whether you're General Motors or whatever, and money's flying back and forth all the time. So it can work, but from a venture capital perspective, we're kind of small, relatively small mom and pops, right? Even my firm, which manages about 5 or 6 billion, we're only 40 people, and that includes everybody at every level. So we don't need more paperwork. So if you take the Chinese money, it triggers a whole bunch of restrictions and reporting requirements, things that you can't and can invest in. If you want to invest in some new semiconductor technology in the US that might in the future have defense applications, you might be limited in investing in that if some of the money you're bringing to the table traces its roots back to China.
So it's really a question of administrative friction more than anything else.
Administrative friction to the point that it limits your ability to do what you want to do. And if you really want to bore the audience, you and I can talk for the next 30 minutes on CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the US, which is really what looms large on this, as does the export control, which we can also bore people with if you'd like.
Be worth a sentence or two about what each of those is, just for those who aren't familiar with it.
So CFIUS is it's an acronym, and you should know it if you're in the business world, and it's been in the news lately. So CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., and it's a committee, and it's in Washington D.C., and they're here to help. Being
Mm.
sarcastic there, anything with that name, is not going to be helpful. But it's a little bit of a random process that can prevent and or unwind deals that have already happened with money coming in from outside the US. And they really focus on particular countries, and China's the main focus right now. So if you have a startup company that's raising money or wants to be acquired, it limits your ability to take money from China or to be acquired. And it's kind of an opaque process. It's hard to predict which way it goes. And it's not efficient. Export control is a kind of a simple idea that has become complicated. And the notion there is if Michael and I start a company, and we're making a consumer product like a better pen, well, no one cares. We can sell that pen around the world, and no one in Washington, D.C. is going to think a second about it. If we develop a new type of missile for war, well, that's obvious. So Mike and I probably would know, before we sell that missile to another country, maybe we should call someone up in Washington, D.C. and ask if it's okay. And they would give us the 852 pages of export control and say, yep, on page 30, no missiles, can't sell missiles to other countries without our approval. That's export control. But the real complicated part that trips up startups is what we call dual use. And it depends on how you define dual use. Dual use means it's a semiconductor chip for my phone, but you know what? It also works really well in the inertial guidance system in an ICBM, or even some biotechnology. It cures cancer, but if you tweak this gene, it's a really awesome bioweapon, right? Now, when you're a startup, you don't know about all these rules, and sometimes you develop your product, you put it on the internet, people buy it, you're selling it, and all of a sudden you get a call from someone in Washington, D.C. saying, that's covered by export control. And it also ties in closely with the classified stuff. So think about this. So if you work with a large company, they have plenty of lawyers and they know that if something's classified, they quickly lock the door and put a sign on the lab saying this is classified. And there's a whole process for that. Um, but a lot of stuff is developed independently, and an entrepreneur comes up with something that if it was developed in a large corporation, it would have been stamped classified but from at the beginning. But at the startup, they didn't think of it like that. And then they put it on the internet and it's been open sourced and it's kind of too late to classify it. So all these things can lead to friction. And as a society, we need to minimize the friction, even if it involves taking some risk, because otherwise you won't have the next generation of innovative startups, which is responsible for pretty much all of the growth over the decades, right? It all happens in startups.
So when you look at a new startup, well, actually, let me ask a different question first. So you used the phrase Chinese money a couple of times. What is Chinese money? Like when you look at an investor who's coming in as an LP or as a co-investor, how do you assign a state to their money?
Yeah, so we could talk a lot about object-oriented analysis and object-oriented programming if we have some software people on the line. It's hard because money is fungible. These days, money isn't even money unless you're dropping off 1.5 billion in cash on pallets in Tehran, right? But in general, money is just bits flowing through. And in the old days, the phrase money laundering was used because it was actually true cash. But I don't mean this in a negative thing. If money goes from one country to another and back again through transactions, what was the original source of that money? So in this case, what we're talking about, Michael, is a direct transfer where um, before President Xi, you would have a Chinese entity. It could be a company. It could be Huawei. Huawei is saying, "Oh, I want to invest in this U.S. venture capital fund. I'm wiring you money from my account at Huawei." So that's clearly quote unquote Chinese money, or a state pension fund, or a government fund. The tricky thing is if you take money from London. And it's like, where did that money come from? Oh, it came from British Telecom. Okay, yeah, that's British. Sure, we'll take the money. But then you look at who are British Telecom's investors, and I'm sure there's a lot of Chinese investors that own shares in British Telecom. So does that mean I'm taking Chinese money via British Telecom? The good news is accountants that are pretty organized and smart have all this figured out, and there's, 859 pages that describe the definition of Chinese money. But in general, the common sense rule usually applies here.
Got it. Um, so when you look at a startup that has sovereign risk of some sort, either they're buying stuff from overseas, they're selling stuff overseas, there's people involved who have visa risk, there's co-investors, whatever it is. How do you think about sovereign risk as part of your investment diligence process? Like, what are the questions that you ask, or that people in VC more broadly ask, or that maybe people should ask but aren't asking?
Yeah, I think the first one and the obvious easy one is actually currency risk.
Mm.
And that's huge because that really impacts your returns. I bought a house in Korea for our family about 5 or 6 years ago, and the dollar is, up like 20%, right? So I've lost 20% without even trying because the Korean won has gone down. And I don't hedge. I'm an individual, and venture people usually don't hedge. Big Wall Street firms hedge, and IBM hedges because they've got the ability to do so. So IBM doesn't care so much about currency fluctuations, so they don't talk about it. But venture capitalists really care uh, about currency fluctuations. So that's one. The other big one is shifting regulation when it comes to repatriating the profits back. So if I have a big IPO or a big M&A and I want to get the money back to my US investors, can I? I hope I can, but even if I can, how long does it take and what sort of taxes are involved? The taxes are huge. The third category of sovereign risk is sort of, societal stability. You want to invest in countries where you feel the rule of law is going to continue. And also, in general, war is not helpful. It's been, I will say, however, humanity is resilient. And while tragedy happens every day at the individual level, right, worldwide, so I don't minimize that. As we speak, there's, suffering and death everywhere, right? That's sad, but with 7.8 billion people or whatever on the planet, that happens. But we were always amazed when all the trouble, and the trouble has been happening off and on in various places like the Middle East for years, but when the recent bout happened, we had companies and investments that had teams in Tel Aviv, and it was scary. It was like, wow, is do people make it? And the initial thought was, oh, it's going to kill the company, and everyone's going to be out of a job, and it's going to be a depression. And it was the triumph of the human spirit and the resilience that everyone got back to work. Now, a lot of the staff went lower because a lot of people were called up for defense, right? But still, our exposure and investments in Israel have done quite well, even during the worst of times. And let's look at Ukraine. Who would have thought that 4 years in, I think it's four, maybe more, into what's been a horrible situation for the soldiers and for the people and for the country, that Ukraine is actually a world leader in drone technology, both hardware and software and operations. And through the war and through these times of, tumult, um, Western countries are spending lots of time in Ukraine and flying Ukrainians elsewhere to say, hey, teach us what you've built, teach us what you've learned. And I don't think anyone predicted that. So I'm going off topic, and I apologize if I'm, upsetting or offending anyone, but it is a reality of the today's tech world that it's inherently integrated with these combat zones because technology is being deployed so quickly in these areas.
Yeah, one of the things that I've noticed when it comes to sovereign risk is oftentimes US investors and board members misunderstand their exposure when they participate overseas. So there's a lot of, I mean, pretty much every regime in the world has a corporate structure that you can start. Um, but in the US, we're used to that corporate structure being pretty clean to shut down in most cases. Like the board members, generally speaking, are not personally liable for what happens at the company. That is not the default around the world. Um, and so one of the things that I've seen is I've seen people discover, much to their chagrin, that the downside case is not that things go to zero in a lot of places. Have you guys run into anything like that, or are you careful about running things through local lawyers first?
Oh yeah, no, Michael, it's a great point, and yes, I have direct experience with it. And just to make it personal, sadly, I'm shutting a company down here in the U.S. as we speak, last night and early this morning. And because there's a good process for doing so and a clean process, quite frankly, it frees up my time where I'm spending all my time trying to find jobs for these people. And, thank God I found jobs for most of them, because it hurts, I mean, big statistics are not emotional, but, a handful of people in front of you that are losing your job, it hits you. So I'm freed up to spend time, trying to find jobs for them. But some of the work I've done overseas and, name the country, China, Singapore, Japan, France, try shutting a company down. Sometimes it's like a year or two where you have to leave the shell open, and in that time, you're liable for claims, both financial and civil claims, maybe even criminal. Or it's like, oh, maybe I don't even want to enter the country. And I'm talking France. I'm not talking Iran or even China. So you have to get the local lawyers involved, as you say, upfront. And it's not that anyone's doing anything nefarious. It's just if you run afoul of the regulation, you can get in serious trouble. What that leads to is people saying, you know what, I'm just not going to do it. So although I talk a big game, I'm an internationalist, I do stuff internationally, I have to admit my comfort zone, which I said you shouldn't go to, but my comfort zone is the US. Because even if you do everything right in some of these other countries, it just costs a lot more money, takes more time. So whenever we give advice, not that anyone asks us too often, but the US isn't perfect. We have lots of problems. But when it comes to the processes for starting, growing, and ending companies, I think a lot of these other developed countries really should harmonize their rules with us to the extent that they could.
One of the things that I think a lot of people don't realize about the life of a VC is that, you know, the sort of conventional Silicon Valley-ish VCs, let's say they do 20 investments out of a fund. They're going to shut down 16, 17 of those, roughly speaking, at some point in their life. Maybe 15 if they're doing really well, maybe 20 if they do really poorly. Um, and you spend a lot of effort working with people who are closing their companies down. And if that activity is frictional and involves a lot of liability in a given jurisdiction, it just means that you don't have time to do anything else, right? If you're doing power law returns and 90% of the return in the fund is in the one outlier, you're going to be shutting down or selling off all of the others at some point.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. And we always say, try to spend more time with the winners and the ones that can really make an impact on society and make an impact on your fund. But you wind up spending so much time with the ones that are not winning and that are failing because of some of the rules and regulations. That doesn't help anybody. So, we try to be judicious in how we spend our time. We try to set things up properly from the beginning. Um, but more importantly, the most important thing about the venture capital business are the entrepreneurs. We're just service providers. We're like lawyers, accountants. I always say we're like the person renting you the office. We're like the group that comes at night and cleans the office and replaces the toilet paper in the bathroom. I mean, you know, I really try to be humble about that. I always say if I was truly creative and I liked risk and I had an original idea, I'd be an entrepreneur. But I'm not creative. I don't like risk. I don't have an idea. So I'm the perfect venture capitalist. Uh, and so, who do I want to spend time with? And you know this, Michael, as an investor, because you're on all sides of this and you're an investor. Given a free minute, I want to spend time with entrepreneurs, young entrepreneurs, old entrepreneurs, everyone in the middle, professors. I spend lots of time walking the halls of academia, whether University of Washington or Caltech or National University of Singapore. Um, and that's where the future is. And if I'm not spending enough time there, I'm never going to do a good job as a venture capitalist. If you don't love technology and if you don't love innovators, this is the wrong job for you. And I tell that to a lot of younger people because I often lecture at business schools, and somehow I don't know why, but culturally, venture capital got put on somewhat of a pedestal where it's like, oh, I want to be a venture capitalist. And I would say, well, look, if you want to be a venture capitalist, go be something else first and be really good at it, whether it's a scientist or an entrepreneur or whatever. Or sometimes people say, oh, well, I want to make a lot of money. It's like, okay, that's fine. At least you're self-actualized and that's your goal. Nothing wrong with that. Money is coupons of happiness. Without money, I can't eat. But if you want to make a lot of money, especially in the short or medium term, there's better ways to make money, whether it's Wall Street or become a lawyer or start your own business right away. Venture capital is sort of if you do get rich, and not everyone does, it's definitely a get rich slow business, like years and years and years. So if you don't love it, when my first firm, Arch Venture Partners, when we got started, it was right before my time there, but the management fee was so low, everyone was pretty much working for free. Like literally, they didn't have a salary. Now they were young, so they were living in their parents' basement and eating cans of beans, like any entrepreneur would do. Um, but yeah, anyway.
It's one of the things that, and I'll remind the audience, if anyone wants to send a question, send it through the Q&A dialogue. But one of the things that I have observed about VCs is that the there is it's perceived as very high status because most entrepreneurs find themselves going and shaking the hat to the VC community, and the VCs are perceived as being very powerful. But one of the things I've learned as I've gotten a little bit older, a little bit longer in the tooth, is that, you know, the thing that VCs provide, which is capital, is it's in some ways it's the ultimate commodity. Now, a great VC will provide useful advice and connections and all kinds of other things, but that's a small fraction of the community. The When you see a deal that's obviously good and that is, you know, the right people, the right ideas, the right market, something that is obviously a great investment, you get a line of VCs around the block fighting to get into it. And you see the other side of it, which relatively few people see, which is they're fighting to put their money into the deal, right? And I think that side of it doesn't get as much press because there's so few people who really see inside of it.
Yeah, that's true, and it especially has to do with the stage of the investment. So once something becomes obvious, if a startup is formed, doing well, then every venture capitalist on Sand Hill Road comes out of the woodwork and wants to put money in. Um, I think what some entrepreneurs and some professors find frustrating is at the early stage, where clearly there's something very promising, could be a cure for cancer. Um, and you just can't get a venture capitalist interested because they say, "Oh, well, call me back when you've proven it." You know, call me back when you've, washed out all the risk. So we always say there's venture capitalists and there's venture capitalists. There's venture capitalists that believe in the word venture, um, and there's venture capitalists that's more of a later stage type of investment. And what I've always enjoyed doing is the early stage work, um, where you have to roll up your sleeves and try to understand what the professor, and I say professor because a lot of the stuff that I've done has been semiconductors or telecom or optics, or my firm's done biotech. And the truth is, most of those inventors tend to have a lot of technical experience. They may still be in their 20s, but they're either in PhD programs or they just finished. Clearly, a lot of the software and application work, I'm not minimizing the difficulty of doing that, but it's the type of thing that you can do when you're a little bit, younger, in your field. So it's not always professors, but for me, it frequently is.
Mm. So you're heavily into semiconductors and deep tech, almost all of which touches Taiwan in one way or the other. How do you think about Taiwan risk? Like when you're looking at a chip company or a semi-cap company or someone who's taping out to TSMC, like do you think about that as risk that has to be mitigated in some way?
It's definitely risk, but I can't mitigate it, right? There's nothing I could really do. I mean, I can have other deals with other foundries in Singapore or the US or elsewhere, but by and large, I know this sounds funny. I'm just being honest. We just hope for the best. It would be a disaster if Taiwan was no longer, right? And there's many shades of gray as to what happens there, right? Hopefully, but if they're no longer independent, if the fabs get shut down, if the fabs stop operating because of some violent event, you know, there's bigger problems than just the venture capital industry, obviously. But from our perspective, I know it sounds silly. Maybe we're just putting our fingers in our ears and pretending nothing's happening. Um, but we just go full bore and try not to worry about that risk. And look, I've been to Hsinchu City outside Taipei. I've seen all the fabs. I met with the great Morris Chang, one of the honors of my life. He's the founder of TSMC. And but despite the international way that the semiconductor industry has developed, as you know, the latest technology is still centered there, and it would be a disaster if that went offline. And so I'd be interested in your thoughts because I know you're very active in this space too. How do we mitigate it?
That's a long. We could do a whole session on that.
Mhm.
The short answer is it's not easy, and because it's a whole ecosystem, it's not just one company. And like you go to a startup and you say, let's say you're going to a hot startup that's doing a really cool chip project, and you say, I have this worry about Taiwan, and I really want you to make your chips somewhere that is not exposed to Chinese escalation. Well, right, Korea's out because Korea is, if something goes wrong in Taiwan, Korea's going to have a problem. So is Japan. So Samsung's not going to work. The Japanese fabs are not advanced enough. Um, you're obviously not going to go do it at SMIC. Um, and so you're left with Intel. And, Intel's a great company in a lot of ways, but I don't know a single startup that's ever been successful working with Intel Foundry Services. So it's like, all right, if you're doing advanced silicon, what do you do? There isn't an obvious answer. So, yeah, that we could do a follow-up conversation about that. I have one question from the audience, and then we'll end there. You mentioned that there have been changes in the way VCs operate in other countries and a small shift away from the fear of failure. How do you think this shift might accelerate idea creation and the like abroad? And how could it shift the dominance of major companies in places like Korea, Japan, or maybe even the state-owned enterprises in China?
I think it's a great question. Thank you, and happy to take more questions. And sometimes the ruder, the better. It's more fun. This was a very polite question, and it's a great question, but happy to take rude questions too. Um, it kind of all starts with culture, and it bubbles up from the bottom. It's hard to do top-down changes in a society. When I first started going to Singapore in 2000, so 26 years ago, the government recognized this and wanted more entrepreneurship. So what they did essentially was top down. They said, "Thou shalt be more entrepreneurial." You know, it's like, no, that's kind of it's kind of like if you have a committee on entrepreneurship, it's probably not entrepreneurial. And I've said that before. If you have a department of innovation, maybe you'll never be innovative. Um, I think that's changed, and you're seeing it generationally, where young people are now saying, you know what, I think I'll take a year off after college and I won't go work at a big company. I'll do a startup. And some of that is just the international nature of everything as the decades go by. Some of it is role models. All you need is one or two successful entrepreneurs in Tokyo or Singapore, and all of a sudden, a lot of kids are like, oh, maybe I could do that. More importantly, their parents see the role model.
Hmm.
Because when I, long, long ago, I come from a working class family on Long Island. When I finished my PhD, my mom was really worried. She's like, PhD in physics, what are you going to do? You can't get a job with that. And fortunately, I got a job at Bell Labs because I was able to tell her it was the phone company. She's like, "Oh, I'm so proud of my son. I always wanted my son to get a job at the post office or the phone company because that's a nice, stable job." If I would have told her I was going to go work at a startup, she would have shot me. And that's how it is in lots of countries where the parents would be upset if you didn't take the job at that big multinational. But it's changed because of role models. There have been successful startups, especially in Singapore and some other places. Not so much in Tokyo, but there have been some. Yeah, so I think that's the answer to the question. It happens slowly, happens bottom up, and the families are key to it, not the government institutions that mandate risk taking.
So does this perhaps this means, I'll just make it a statement rather than a question. Perhaps what this means is that if you want to produce an entrepreneurial culture as a state, rather than doing mandates, maybe what's necessary is that you pick a couple of winners and just force the circumstances in which they get enough state backing that they win, and it shifts the cultural attitude
It's
and
all
shifts
about
what parents have to say.
It's making, identifying, and advertising a hero and making that hero a celebrity. How many entrepreneurs in the US got excited because they thought Steve Jobs was like this most amazing, compelling person? How many startups wanted to be as rich as Bill Gates, right? It's all about role models.
I mean, I can't tell you how many young people I run into over the last few years who maybe carry it even a step too far, where they say, well, Elon has three companies going. Why can't I? I'm raising for three different companies at once. And I have to sort of talk them down and say, well, Elon earned the right to have five different companies going at the same time because the first one really, really went well. when he was fully focused on it. So I'll give you one more question from the audience if you have a moment. I so this is from I'm not gonna out him by name because he didn't explicitly say he wants to, but he's a European hardware VC. He says, how do you approach the early stage deals outside the comfort zone when it comes to the tech risk? Meaning the startup is before market validation of their tech and product. It's obvious, it's an easier pill to swallow if the company is domestic, but is it a hard no when you look internationally?
Yeah, no, it's not a hard no, and thank you for the question. I spent a lot of time in Europe. It's funny because this question is relevant to one of my projects right now that I'm having trouble with that I'm shutting down. The problem is I took that early stage tech risk and I combined it with syndicate risk, meaning I didn't have a big enough group of trusted venture capitalists around us from the beginning, and that's what we needed. I don't have the wherewithal, frankly, to carry it forward through all the tech risk. So I think that's a partial answer to your question is deep tech risk is fine, but you have to be clear-eyed in knowing that it may take much longer to extinguish that risk and get to a saleable product. So that means at the early stage, we like to syndicate and bring in more friends and more venture capitalists, even if it means I have to own a smaller percent. But it just gives me comfort that if things go sideways for a while, but we still believe in it, we can all pass the hat, right? We talk about pass the hat rounds where we don't have to grovel and get on our knees and beg new people to come in. The existing group can invest and carry that technology through. And I have so many existence proofs of how that works well because technology, not always, but almost always takes longer than you think.
Thanks. Any final thoughts, things that you think are going on in the world that touch VC that are interesting and non-obvious from the outside, or predictions for how things are going to evolve over the next few years? Like anything that you think would be interesting as a closing thought.
Yeah, it's so hard because you touch upon so many topics today, but I would just lead with, one of optimism. I'm actually very optimistic, and that's not a popular point of view these days, right? Everyone's like, "Woe is me, the world's ending," but I'm a student of history, and I've read as much as I could about the last, 5,000 years of recorded history, and I think a lot of things are in place for optimism. You know if you know anything about the hundreds of millions of people that have been brought out of abject poverty in the last few decades, it's actually continuing. Now, look, there's many pockets of people going backwards, but by and large, the standard of living is increasing on average. And the reason for that is manyfold. It's got to be good governance, got to be culture, but a big part of that is innovation. And I'm not trying to say that, oh, we're real important and technologists and startups are the most important part of the world. That's not true. But if we're going to continue the rise, if we're going to solve these problems, it's all about innovation and it's all about international collaboration to the extent possible. Although the US is still the single biggest economy. It's only 25% of the world's economy or whatever is in the US, right? Maybe we got 4.8% of the population. It is pretty amazing we have 25% of the GDP, and someone could check those numbers. But the truth is, there's so much going on elsewhere. And that's why I do love places like, well, obviously Silicon Valley, but I do love places like Tel Aviv and Singapore because you do see people from all around the world working together to solve these problems. So it may seem naive, but I like to end on a note of optimism.
Patrick, thank you very much. This is Patrick Ennis of Madrona Ventures, and uh, really appreciate your taking the time to do this with me and with S for Geo. And thank you again very much.
No, thank
Have a
you.
good
Thank
day.
you, everyone. Bye bye.